What is up, Dragon Ball Super community? This is Markus and Shane. Danny's absent today, unfortunately. We have Russel Stelzer with us. We're going to be talking about some of the competitive aspects of deck choice and deciding on how to approach certain matchups. And Russell's going to put us through a little lesson on Towa at the end of all this. So let's just start off with something simple. What do you think is one of the most important factors when it comes to like determining like sideboard slots towards matchups that may be unfavorable with any deck you choose to take to a competitive event?
I think personally for me, it just kind of goes like, obviously I look at like what are my worst matchups, and I typically try to dedicate a few slots to that. Like for example, at Pasadena and Philly, this past month, the two events that I played Towa, I think that Baby is a very strong deck against Towa, but for some reason, just a lot of people aren't playing it right now, even though I think it's a very like well-positioned deck. And if they go like turn 2 or 3, like Big Ape and play strategies, you literally have no out to until you can awaken. So they get like 1 to 2 free turns of just like
Kind of
blowing up anything you play and just swinging big triple strike on you. So I've decided to side to Heavenly Wizards for both events, just in case I ran into that. I can deal with it early. Fortunately, I never played a single Baby at both events, but it was just there because I knew it could have been a blowout if I didn't have it, and it was just 2 slots.
I mean, that's fair. And I think that's one of those cards that also, like, the fact that it doubles up and being good against Green Broly.
Exactly.
Like it's a reasonable sideboard card that you didn't dedicate too many slots to, but you were respecting a matchup that you knew was bad, even if it wasn't popular.
And I think like anytime you side deck, you should always have like 2 to 3 slots open for a card like that, for like a niche matchup that could be really bad. Even if it wasn't such a flexible card, like against Green Brawly, I think you'd still side it. But yeah, I think being able to just have like that couple cards that just comes in a very unfavorable matchup and actually makes it probably swings it in your favor if you draw it in your opening hand or second turn.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's something that I always look for.
So in that kind of matchup, would you try to aggressively mulligan for said card, or would you still try to mulligan to advance your standard game plan?
I think that in a deck like Towa, I definitely mulligan for that card, just because Towa, it can do a lot with very little. You get to search out like most of your deck anyways.
Right, it kind of fixes itself.
Yeah, so mulliganing for that side deck card that especially if you need to see it in the early turns, is important. If it's something that you don't need to see right away, then you can just kind of like mulligan for your Vegetas and whatnot. But as far as something like Heavenly Wizard where I need to see it early, then yeah, I go for that.
That makes sense. Shane, what do you think?
Typically, like with my sideboards, I think Zap's that, and I've always tried to follow it. Like,
We're losing signal on you, buddy.
try to make, and then. Sorry, I live in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
All right, anyway,
there you go.
try to do the thing like I think Zap's talked about in the past. Is what I've always tried to do. Make the good matchups great, and try to make the bad matchups tolerable.
See, I'm kind of on the opposite end of that. I prefer to make the bad matchups, like, if you can make a bad matchup more than 50-50 in your favor, like, even if it's just 55-45 in your favor, while maintaining a neutral to positive win ratio against your good matchups, then you're doing something good there if you're confident in your skill level. Because with a high enough skill level and a little bit of variance on your side, obviously, because, you know, to win a tournament, usually you have to have some amount of luck in your favor. If you can make your bad matchups in your favor and then just outskill your good matchups, then you have less to worry about, I think. But like that's just a matter of preference. I see what you're saying with your side of the argument for sure. It's totally reasonable to say like crush all of your good matchups, and then just like sometimes you just got to take an L.
I do think it's like it also depends a lot on what you expect the meta to be going
Right.
into the event. If there's a matchup that you think is really good in your favor, but you don't expect it to be like heavily represented, then maybe you probably don't dedicate a ton to that. But if it's something like, Janemba is typically just an absolute auto win. I haven't for Towa. I think I played 5 Janembas in the last 2 events and haven't dropped a single game to them with the deck. Like if you open Vegeta, it's pretty much a wrap.
Right.
But there are times, like the way they win is if you don't see Vegetas and they happen to like mill all your Vegetas, or they side in some removal like Family of Justice Go 10 and kill it early, and you just can't really stabilize from that. So in that regard, I did side deck like Power Overseeing Time Trunks, just because that is a super favorable matchup for me and one that I shouldn't lose. But I know that Janemba is always going to be a heavily represented deck, so I side that just because I'm never going to... If I see 2 to 3 Janembas a tournament, then that's 2 to 3 free wins for me, just by having that Trunks in there for like security.
And that's
I
reasonable.
think that deck choice has a lot to go into that whole like debate on the sideboard.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all agree that on average you want to have like there's always going to be some card that'll make any one matchup better. So having a sideboard that's fleshed out enough to where you always have something to bring in every matchup to make every matchup better after your sideboard, unless the matchup is just literally you can't lose it, then and you have no reason to sideboard, like there should almost always be something you can bring in out of your board. So like that's where kind of preparation, understanding where your sideboard options can cross over, so you're not sitting there with 4 copies of one card for one matchup that doesn't go in against any other deck.
Right, like a good example was like when we went to Ohio and we played the skillless deck. Like we just accepted the fact we were going to lose the striving and didn't even try to like play it. Like if they played striving, we were just going to...
Yeah, we just kind of hoped that there was less people playing striving at that event, which I got the unfortunate end of that stick.
Fortunately, my striving opponent got a game lost.
It was the same guy I lost to in Swiss too. Funny enough, but yeah. So like we were just hoping to avoid that matchup, like Shane was saying.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we like our sideboard options were like 3 TN, 3 Haru, and 3 Killy Zone, and like we just before all these new counterplays, we would just bring in all these cards that made the matchup that they were like. For example, TNs were just 1 energy 15k attackers, because the version of Skillless we were playing was just aiming to kill people on turn 3 or turn 4. And so at that point, it was just like a better card than some of the other junk that was in the main deck. Like against Janemba, you don't really need negates that much. Like sometimes you need a negate or 2, but for the most part, you don't need a grip of negates. So you can bring some of those out and bring in TNs or something, you know?
Yeah, no, like obviously right now. Oh, go ahead.
I was also super greedy and playing 3 of the 8 drop Fu in my 65 just to like duke them.
That card's so good though.
It is very good.
If you build a board and you play that guy, it's gross.
Well, we were playing Dimension Support in the main deck and 4 Training Buddy Krillin. So we are definitely trying to build a board.
Yeah, just go wide.
Yep.
Yeah, I had a mirror match where on...
Sorry for a little technical difficulty there. If you hear a cut, we had some technical difficulties, to be simple. But back into the topic, we had been talking about skillless, when we played skillless in Ohio, the sideboard cards we were choosing, like TN, Haru, and Killy Zone, and about essentially like how to have a flexible sideboard. But we moved on from that one onto having specific sideboard card or having specific adjustments to the main deck based around bad matchups or good matchups. And Russell, you had information on us with what you did with Towa in that regard, right?
Yeah. So was this about like was this about the Heavenly Wizard or the?
Yeah. Well, it was after that. It was like the time disruptor.
Yeah. So just like main decking, like you can dedicate some slots in your main deck, especially when you have a deck like Towa that's so consistent in what it wants to do. when it searches out a lot of its pieces, that means that you can dedicate more of your deck space to like tech cards, right? I guess if you're talking about other leaders like Clash of Fates Goku, that's another leader where every card that's green technically isn't dead because it can just turn into a free draw too.
Yeah, for
so you
sure.
could, in decks like that, you could tech in like a God Strike or the ultimate box or anniversary box Goku that pops barrier cards.
Or that new green extra card we got coming out, the draft box, the one that pops something costs greater than or equal to energy.
Yeah.
The new
exactly.
Father Son Kamehameha, the upgraded one. That's a green card that would
that
be
card's
good.
insane.
That would be a great sideboard card, or even splash to the main deck if you think you have a bad matchup with that style of effect, and just be able to discard it when you don't need it. So like you were saying, the fact that your deck is flexible enough, you can afford certain leeways.
So that's just something important when you're building your deck. Like, what can your deck do? Like, how flexible is it? Can I afford to run? Like God Strike is like, it can be kind of an awkward card because obviously if you're playing against a matchup that you need it against, it's amazing. But if you're playing against a matchup that's like maybe a little more aggro and you're not going to have the ability to tap 2, you're like, oh god, I don't want this in my main deck, but I can always just pitch it for lead and draw 2.
Yeah, totally reasonable. Whereas, like, what would be a good example of a deck where you don't really have that flexibility that you consider a meta deck?
I guess,
maybe like U6. U6 is a really linear deck that like kind of does the same thing every game. And when you start splashing cards that don't directly progress through game state, it can cause the deck to stumble.
Yeah, exactly. So like U6, like you can play it with different leaders. Like I know Jordan Beard was playing it with Shenron.
Right.
And the other Canada dudes were playing it with Brawly or whatnot just so they could tech in more stuff. But with a deck like that where its engine needs to hit its pieces in an early turn, it is harder to tech in that.
Yeah, because you have like less time to accumulate resources, and so like whereas Towa can craft its hand over the course of several turns, with a deck like U6 where you're trying to do the thing on turn 2 every game, it needs to be as consistent as possible.
Yeah, like if you go back or format, it also gets wrecked by other counterplays. But like Skillless was a deck where you had like almost no wiggle room. Like you had very, very little wiggle room to like make the deck function differently.
Right. Like all the turns you had where every play you would be making, you had to consider would it be better than just like doing what the deck normally does. And most of the time it wasn't. So you just kind of streamlined the deck, make it as powerful as possible in what it was doing, and try to improve upon that post board for the matchups that were relevant. But I know there's some decks like Shenron Gogeta, for example, that while being a very linear deck, it sees a lot of cards very quickly, and has the ability to have those kind of flexible options in the sideboard that, or even maybe like 1-ofs or 2-ofs in the main deck, because it sees so many cards, that it's not going to directly hinder the strategy in most situations.
Yeah, like Shenron Gogeta is definitely like extremely flexible. I think, Anthony Hernandez, his build obviously did good for him. He got second place. But I think going forward, now that Towa got its first like big win, like you have to expect Towa is going to continue to see more play because, the more regionals come out, that means the more Vegetas that are being given out for participation prizes alone. So people are getting more Vegetas on their hand, which means more people can afford the deck. And it's obviously arguably the best deck, if not the most flexible deck in the format.
That was actually.
So I think that.
Sorry,
go ahead.
That was actually one of the questions we wanted to ask. Was what did you think was going to be the deck to beat at this point in meta?
I think it's Towa. I think just because there are so many good decks, so we see this diverse format, and Towa is just a very flexible deck in what it can do. If it needs to go aggro, it can go aggro. If it needs to sit back and just rip your hand, it can do that. It's just the deck has so many different lines of play that it can take that you can tend to play around even like bad matchups where you have Shenron Gogeta is it can't go aggro obviously because it has to ramp and it has to wait till it can play its stuff. which is why I think I don't think Anthony's build is good going forward
Because he didn't have
because
any respect for aggro.
yeah, he doesn't have it doesn't respect the fact that like Towa can go aggro too. It's a very greedy build. You know, it runs the 1-star, it runs the Super Dragon Balls.
Yeah, it did great
Um,
for him, but like you said, going
mhm,
forward with people expecting it for sure now, like
mhm,
we might see an aggressive shift in the meta, and that'll just
mhm.
punish all of the Shenron or Peruga decks that aren't playing something like Striving and or Nimbus in their main deck.
Yeah, and I remember it was before that finals match because Jordan and Anthony had played in Swiss and drew in Swiss. So I remember before that finals match, I had like gone up to Jordan. I was like, "How did you play that matchup in Swiss? Like, why did you guys go to time?" And he said that he sat back a little bit more and tried to like roast his hand, and it worked the first time. But then the second game, Anthony was able to just like ramp into. I think he got him with Oob, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I could see that.
Um, and so I told him, I was like, just beat face. I was like, Shenron Gogeta, just go full aggro, smooth your Vegetas. I mean, you saw it, and I mean, the finals was over with pretty quickly.
Right.
Like, he just kind of went aggro, and just it wasn't
Yeah,
close.
I think it's hard for the Toa deck to accomplish that without the skillless engine because, you know,
Mm-hmm.
as a trend of Overwhelm, you get powerful effects, but they don't give you board presence.
Mm-hmm.
And the skillless engine kind of remedies that situation a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, all your turns prior to turn 4 give you the option of being aggressive when you're playing the skillless engine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Whereas,
think the
like,
skillless engine definitely like favors the more aggro route. I think either build is like still extremely
for
favorable
sure.
against Gogeta. But yeah, definitely a skillless route can go a little more over the top just because you get that 20k body.
Right, or like just being able to play Goku for a little bit of extra card advantage, stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. So would you say it's a little far fetched to say that Toa is like a more consistent and more flexible version of Android Cell Chain?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. Coming from somebody that is like my favorite pet deck was Super 17.
Right.
Like I tell people like all the time, it feels like I'm playing that deck, especially against matchups like Janemba. It feels like I'm playing Super 17, but a little bit more smooth in a sense that I don't have to play a Hellfighter out on turn 3 and then
Right.
wait an extra turn to like go off. I can go off all on one turn.
Yeah, it's a little bit more forgiving for variance, and the deck
Mm-hmm.
kind of like does its thing intentionally and
Mm-hmm.
doesn't put a bunch of limitations or restrictions on it.
Yeah.
Like where Cell Chain originally, you had to have the 3-drop plus 17 and 18 in hand plus a
Mm-hmm.
5 and a 7-drop in your deck. Like all of those pieces had to be in line for you to pull it off. And
Mm-hmm.
even then, it was card disadvantage, and it was easy to predict and easy to play around.
Yeah.
But like with the Toa engine, it doesn't make them discard; it makes them warp, so it's immune to Mercenary Tau, and
Mm-hmm.
the cards that they discard or warp rather are just gone forever. You know,
Yeah.
so like there's a lot of relevant text that is kind of overlooked in how it impacts matchups that like hand destruction is traditionally good against, and how it ends up
Mm-hmm.
being better. Like for example, Janemba can't just go and say, "Okay, you're gonna make me discard cards. I'll just discard this all too easy."
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're playing the Mira and they have to warp 3 cards, they have to put a lot of consideration into what they have to warp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Like that. That's it. Another reason, like against the like Brawly HOM is a pretty interesting matchup. I know the deck doesn't see as much play now because it losing Killy Zone and battering hurt quite a bit. Um, but I mean, the deck is still around. It can still top if people like don't respect it. I know in Pasadena, me and Marcus Cantarsi played. He was playing Brawly HOM. I was playing Toa, and we ended up drawing. And it was like one of the craziest matchups I've like ever played. But that matchup is pretty interesting because it's one where like you just want to sit back. You don't even want to really be playing the 3-drop mirror to make them discard one all the time. You kind of just want to sit back, keep your leader ability on deck, and just warp the cards out of their hand. Because if you don't attack them and you don't give them any free cards and you just start warping the cards, then it becomes really hard for HOM decks to victory strike you,
Yeah,
like
like they
Brawly
can't enable
especially.
Sparking 10.
Yeah, they can't get their Sparking 7, and so then they have to start doing some weird plays and try going like a more like aggro Stormish route against you.
And if you notice, a lot of the Hide Mastery lists that we see, like doing a little bit better, aren't even playing cards like the 2-drop Goku or Mira in the main deck, which makes it a lot harder for them to be aggressive properly. Like the versions playing GnG and Mira can like enable sparking almost instantaneously.
Oh yeah.
And you can't really do anything about it. Plus, they can just be aggressive as heck and push you into the dirt.
Just gives you like an alternate way to win, which I'm always like a big fan of. Like I don't like playing decks where it's like I have like one route to win and no real like optimal backup plan.
Makes sense why you didn't like Storm.
Yeah, I mean Storm was a great deck, but it was just I think more so in like my local scene, like people just absolutely hated the deck, so it was just I never touched it.
Shane knows that feeling well, except he played it every week.
Yeah. It was kind of the same thing with Super Shenron. Like nobody in my locals liked the deck, and so I just never touched it. And there was actually like one guy in our locals because we had like this League Cup challenge going on for a couple of weeks, and he just brought Super Shenron every single week because he really wanted to win.
Super Shenron made me take a break from this game.
Yeah, Super Shenron was I ran Shenron Boo during that format because that was like the one deck that just ran over Super Shenron.
Right. I remember having to play against Shenron Boo in Orlando with Blue Black Demigra. And that was interesting. I was prepared for the Shenron matchups in that I had 3 barrier blockers in my sideboard and 2 Mafuba. So after my opponent went into the Boo chain, he just kind of like sat there and looked at my board, plus my hand of like 8 cards, and like tried to kill me, but like didn't even come close. And it was kind of sad.
Yeah, barrier blockers are like the bane of that deck's existence.
Yeah,
but they killed it when they banned Child's Wish, though.
Yeah, they sure did. Man, they killed one of my favorite decks too, the Hellfighter hand control deck. That's the deck I played in teams when we got first in Atlanta in teams.
Okay.
And,
yeah, that deck was fun.
I got lucky enough to play Genova 3 times.
Genova?
I got lucky enough to play Genova 3 times.
Oh god.
In teams, so like, got just paired up against one of the 3 people. Happened to be Geneva 3 times.
It's funny how like. It's funny in team events how you notice that like a lot of your matchups end up being like the same.
Right.
Like when me, Danny, and Fuji won Orlando Celebrations, I think our last 3 or 4 matches were all the same decks. Like I played against Janemba, except for the finals. Fuji played, I forgot what he was. I think he got the like baby he got like Brawly decks, and then Danny played against like nothing but baby the entire day.
Yeah. It was kind of a mix for us, but there was some repeats.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you played against like 3 Shenron or 3 Janemba, and I played against like 3 Shenron.
Right, and then like Trevor played against like 3 Height of Mastery decks. But it wasn't like every matchup was the same 3 decks. It was just like seeing the same deck in the same slot multiple times during the day.
And like when I did Dallas teams with Ryan, and Ryan's like, "Oh, I'm gonna build this deck that completely relies on Shugesh," and then plays, what
was that, Shane?
When Ryan decides he's gonna play a deck that completely relied on Shugesh, and then plays Cronoa 4 out of 5 rounds.
Oh yeah.
Oh gosh.
In best of 1 teams.
I still remember the finals of Orlando. I was playing against Daniel Brown from Dahan's team. And I knew, so I was on Brawly GT for my team, and he was on Brawly HOM. And I knew he was main decking Cronoa. I didn't know how many copies he was main decking, but I just got lucky, I guess, in that finals because he didn't draw it game 1, and then game 2, by the time he drew it, I think I already played like 1 or 2 Shugesh, so...
Yeah, like, I'm kind of glad Shugesh is gone, because now we don't have that weird dynamic of, like, did I draw Cronoa turn 1? Mm-hmm. No, I'm dead, okay.
It's also just nice not having to just, like, side deck 1 card to stop 1 card.
Right, exactly. No, I definitely agree. So, before we lost audio, or before we lost video recording, you had been talking to us a little bit about some of the things that is like effective against Towa. Since we don't have any of that recorded, I don't think we do at least. We can go over that now, and it'll add to the video. Fortunately,
Especially since I think we can all agree Towa's the deck to beat in Orlando.
yeah,
Yes.
definitely. Like you had said, with so many more regulator promos being given out, the deck's going to become more and more readily played. And while that's almost a good thing because Towa's not an easy deck to pilot, and you'll end up getting a lot of free wins off people thinking they can just pick the deck up. If your deck's not good against Towa, you'll get a lot of free losses regardless of who's playing the deck.
Exactly.
But if you had to like pinpoint one of the flaws of Towa that you could exploit as a person trying to gear yourself for a competitive event, what would it be?
The biggest flaw is just aggro. Any deck that can produce a lot of little attackers in the early turns and just keep swinging is just really hard for Towa to deal with because they're going to have to take the first few attacks. And then as it goes on, they pretty much lose the cards they gained off life because as you keep swinging with those cards, they have to keep discarding from their hand because outside of, like, Towa can deal with going tall very wide. You know, you drop a Gogeta, give it triple attack, triple strike, I can stop that. You know, you go all in on a double striker that's not your leader, I can stop that.
Right.
You know, so decks that just go super wide are really hard to deal with. Decks that are like leader based are pretty good. Like if you do a lot of your damage with your leader, like Clash Fate's Goku on its backside can give you some problems. If they drop a feat and go up to 35 double strike crit, there's a lot of cards that Towa has to shell out to deal with it because they can't just Towa leader your leader.
Right.
Yes, that'd be ridiculous.
One thing I've noticed about Towa, and just from like watching it play and having played it a little bit myself, it doesn't really draw super combos. Like,
no.
Like most of the time they're in your discard pile or on the bottom of your deck.
Granted, I've never played Towa, but I noticed the same thing playing Massive.
Yeah.
You win more than you actually draw them.
That's why matchups like I said, the mirror match, like super combos and power bursts are really important. So if you see them in your opening hand, and you already have like the starters that you want to see, like Vegeta and Towa, you keep those, because milling super combos and power bursts in the mirror match just feels really bad. But also, like, if you keep them in your opening hand, obviously it lowers your chance of milling them. Because when you do mill them, then you're just giving your opponent information where they're like, okay, I can be a little bit more aggressive because I know you don't have as much defense in your hand.
I think it's also,
like power. Oh, go ahead.
I think it's also one of those things where, like in a matchup, in a mirror match specifically, one of the deciding factors is like who manages their resources better, right? And then you look at variants and who draws more of their card advantage related resources. So things like power bursts that replace themselves and super combos which replace themselves being some of the only true like one-for-one replacement outside of the cards you play, like regulators and scientist foo or whatever, right? A way to gain card advantage on your opponent's turn that is outside of their like scope of expected like results, right? So the best way I can describe it is like they're attacking with X card, and a power burst can throw off their math on how they need a combo on the following attack, you know? Or a super combo could do the same thing. So like having those resources in your hand early is a way to stabilize card advantage in the mid to late game when you really need it.
Yes. That's why like the skillless engine is good in the mirror match too, because it's like the one drop Goku every turn is netting you a card, and then if you use its ability, it's giving you a free attacker without devoting any of your hand to it.
Right.
So it's a way to aggro them down and still like maintain your hand advantage. And then if you're going, then you're also forcing your opponent. You're like, hey, I'm getting closer to killing you, or you're losing your hand to stay alive.
And 4-star balls are really nice targets to warp with mirror. One thing I think a lot of people overlook, if I'm not mistaken, if you're attacking with a battle card that already has double strike, you can Champa and give it another instance of double strike, and Towa can only remove one of the two instances.
Yes.
So like that's something that's not irrelevant. You know, you can attack with a battle card that has double all in on it and Champa that card, or not even necessarily Champa, but Iskai specifically, because you have to declare, right? So making the point of
the hard way.
making the point of declaring double strike on your card that already has double strike can insulate you against situations like that, because that is a skill-based factor, you know?
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, too. For the Towa player and the player playing against Towa, there's a lot to keep track of every turn for Towa. So, like you said, stuff like that, you know, maybe like getting those 2 instances of double strike is very good. Also, if you're playing against Towa, just always be aware of what their count and their warp is. I've had 2 instances, one in Pasadena and one in Philly, where I won a game because my opponent just didn't count my warp. And if they would have just asked to see my warp and counted that there was 10 in there, they could have avoided the entire situation.
Oh, where you surprise awaken on them and take off
yeah.
their effect, yeah.
So in my build, and I told Jordan to throw this in his build too, was the new Trunks from set 7. I think it's one of the best cards to come out in that set.
Yeah.
And it added a ton to Towa. And I get people asking me all the time, like, why not just play like the Supreme Kai that looks at the top 3, or the Bardock that's at 20k when you overwhelm it. But the Trunks warping one is actually just like ridiculously big, because turn 1 you can use your leader ability, warp those 3, play it, then warp 1 from your hand, and at end of turn he goes to warp. That's 5 in warp turn 1. So again, it's aggressive decks. It immediately turns on your super combos turn 1. And then there's little situations where, like, if you have a 7-drop Mirror charge and 1 in hand, and you go into your turn 4 with the 5-drop in hand, like, you don't know what's left in your deck. You know, the other 2 Mirrors could be in your life for all you know.
Right.
Like, so it's kind of like that risk. You don't know how much you have left in there. But if you have Vegeta on board and the Trunks in hand, you can start your turn off by overwhelming, draw 2, and then warp the big mirror in your hand, and then trigger the Vegeta to put the big mirror on the bottom of your deck.
Right.
So that way you know that you have at least 1 in there, and you can go into your 5-drop. So there's just like cool little stuff like that.
So earlier you mentioned how aggro is good into Towa, and what is another detail that you would say, like, maybe effective sideboarding against Towa, or a factor that people could consider if their deck can't go aggressive as a way to hedge against Towa?
I think one card that's really small that most people think is really bad against Towa because it doesn't hit the big one is the Tau. And Tau is, everybody I talk to thinks that card's like bad against Towa, but it's actually really, really good against Towa. And it only stops the 3-drop Miura that discards 1 card, but that card is like one of the best cards in the deck. It does a lot for the deck. It's aggression. It's a way to hit your opponent's hands, and just the fact that it's a free. It doesn't cost anything to overwhelm. It's a cheap overwhelm.
Right.
It's another target for your Vegeta to be able to just like fix your overwhelm in the later turns.
Yeah, it's like one of those cards that, like, while it doesn't seem super impactful, and it's not the card you're like, it doesn't seem like a card you would want to hate out with a sideboard card. It fills out the early turns well enough that if you just shut off 4 of those cards from their deck, or let's just say 3, right, because they play one turn 1 or something, then all of a sudden they're restricted to like overwhelming other cards instead.
Exactly.
In an
it's just
attempt
4
to get
bricks
their card
now.
advantage.
Yeah, it just adds 4 bricks to their deck now, where they essentially aren't playing that Mira unless they're going for game.
Right.
And if they don't play the Trunks, or if they do play the Trunks and they don't see it, now their overwhelms every turn become a little awkward. You know, they don't just have free overwhelms every turn.
Right, like instead of like getting value out of a Mira by drawing a card, make you discard a card, they might like play a Mass Sand to just pressure with a double striker instead of, and draw their card rather than like getting real value out of it.
Exactly, and especially against like the mirror match too. Tau is huge in the mirror match. If you have Tau and your opponent doesn't have Tau, which I believe Jordan wasn't running it. So Jordan, if you're listening to this and we would have played in the finals, I would have 2-0'd you because you didn't have Tau in your sideboard. But it's huge in the mirror match because typically you don't want to be playing your Vegeta first anyways, unless you have like a second one in hand and a Tau to back it up, or a Towa to back it up. So like typically games 2 and 3, I mull to see the Tau, and if I have it in my opening hand, I just slap it down when I hit that 2 energy, because you want to shut that 3-drop mirror off right away.
Right.
Because
As soon
that
as
card
possible.
the 3-drop mirror is insane against every deck, but especially in the mirror match, because like I said, the mirror match is all aggression, all hand size, and a 3-drop mirror just provides both of those. Being able to take a card and then apply pressure all at the same time is really key. And so being able to just shut that off, and if my opponent doesn't shut mine off, that means that I get to play with one of the best cards in the deck, and you don't.
Right, for sure. That's totally reasonable. Now, we talked about the skillless engine in Towa and how good it can make it, because it gives you really good aggressive lines that allow you to retain card advantage. But normally when playing that engine, you have to kind of sacrifice the Toki Toki engine. Going into the meta as we see it, would you say that's still probably the best line, or would you say it's worth reconsidering the Toki Toki engine as a way to be more flexible across the board against decks that are more likely to hate out Towa now?
I think it is worth reconsidering a little bit, just because I think we're in a state now where people realize that Towa is probably just the best all-around deck and the deck to beat going into Orlando. So there should be a higher count of Towa players, which means there should be more decks that are trying to go wide and fast against you. Like I said, if Veggies curves out perfectly, it's really hard. I did play 2 U6s in Philly and beat both of them. But that's because I was running the Toki Toki engine, and I had Time Regulator, Massane, and Kami in my main deck. So it was easier for me to stop aggression earlier and deal with their boards.
Right.
There was one player, I Kami'd him, and then on his turn he swung and I power bursted and brought back the Kami after he had built his board again, and he just goes, "Oh shit."
All of a sudden he's just in this really bad spot again, almost unwinnable, you know?
So I do think it definitely is worth reconsidering, just because there's merits to both. The skillless engine is good in the mirror match, but you have to sacrifice stuff. Jordan was only fitting 2 power bursts in his main deck, and power burst is the god card in the mirror match.
When I saw that from his list, that was one of my only big complaints. Is I feel like that's just a card you have to play 4 of because it's so powerful.
Yeah. And it's just tough because the skillless engine, it's a big engine, so you have to sacrifice stuff.
And even then, he went down to 3/3/3.
Yeah.
He wasn't even playing the 4s.
He also has to sacrifice his mirror counts. I think he was only running 2 of the Overwhelm 3-drops, and then for his foos, I think he was only running 2 Banisher foos. And I like to run a higher mirror and food count just because I hate missing off of the leader ability. And if you miss in a mirror match, it just feels really, really bad because now I'm down a card in the mirror match. Right. And every card counts in that matchup. So I do think it is worth reconsidering the skillless engine. It's good, but just depending on what you expect in Orlando, if you expect to see more decks trying to go wide against you, then it might be worth it to just run the commies with the Toki Toki engine, Massane in the main, time regulators, more power bursts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just a more defensive variation that aims to play a slightly longer game.
Yeah, it's just it gives you a little bit more flexibility for different matchups.
Shane, what do you think?
I was actually going to go on to something different. So earlier, even though I think it got cut off, we were talking the red matchup was kind of bad for Towa. You were specifically talking about Vegeta Baby. So is it fair to say we're probably going to see an uptick in red in Orlando?
I think so. I think I think there should be an uptick in Baby specifically. I think decks like Pan and Frieza Prison, those red decks, I don't think are good against Towa.
Really?
I don't think they're. Frieza Prison is pretty free, and Pan, I know I lost in the finals to Pan in Pasadena, but if your opponent doesn't see Chain Zeno and then draw into Bardock 3 turns in a row, then you win that matchup.
I think I'm just a little bit misconstrued because of the definition of Pan in my head is different now because of some of the innovations of our team and one of our team members, Robert Reitz. and his kind of crazy pan list that in testing for us has been doing pretty well into Towa. But it's nothing like a traditional pan list, so I can totally see what you're saying there. Because like your traditional pan lists, they're much more mid-rangey and don't try to play a super aggressive game. Whereas the pan lists that we've been testing have the ability to kill on turn 3.
Okay. Yeah.
Doesn't always do it, but like with a good draw, turn 3 is not unreasonable.
I just think it depends on like the aggro deck and what you're trying to do. Like universal cards that are really good against Towa are like Source of Power and Digging Deep. Like cards that especially that you can drop cheap that are like 3 drops, dual attack, 20Ks are really hard for Towa to deal with. I think people need to be like careful if they're trying to just go full aggro and wide, but like they're dropping a lot of 2 drops. That's probably not the best route to go against Towa because they go time regulator and just stop your aggression, which is why I ran 4 in Pasadena, is because there was a lot of Pan and Hirudegarn players, and I think I played against like 2 or 3 in Swiss and 2-0'd all of them just because time regulator put in a lot of work in those matchups.
And that's something
or time disruptor. Sorry, I keep saying time regulator. Time disruptor.
And I think that card's super relevant, and I think it always deserves a spot in your deck if you have a hard time versus aggro, because it's so flexible, and the card replacement is relevant. And that's something I liked about the pan list that we had been playing, is that there's only 2 drops or lower in the deck, 2 different ones, and the rest of the attackers are 3 costs or more. So
yeah, and that's the thing.
In that situation.
If you can cheat out 3 drops and you can cheat out a bunch of them early against Towa, like that's really effective, because Time Disruptor it's a card that's definitely shaping the meta, and it's a card that you always have to like worry about. If your deck is susceptible to Time Disruptor, then it's probably not a deck that you want to be running, just because Towa is maining at least 2 to 3 copies in their main and has like a 3rd or 4th copy in a side.
And if they're not, you probably don't need to be worried about them anyways.
Yeah. So it's just
totally
it's just a good card.
So yeah, we kind of went over some of the strengths and weaknesses of Towa, sideboard strategies, and like approaching bad matchups. Was there anything else we wanted to bring up, Shane? Anything specific, at least?
Not that I can think of.
Was there anything else that you want to expand on when it comes to Towa, Russell?
I think the biggest thing is just be aware of like everything the deck can do. Get a lot of repetitions in, and just know that like there's a lot of different ways you play it depending on your matchups. You know, you can sit back, you can go aggro.
It's kind of the defining feature of a mid-range deck, you know?
Yeah, so it's just be aware of what your opponent's deck is doing and what you're trying to do. And I think a lot of like the community definitely wanted more of these like matchup knowledge decks, and just especially since we're in a very diverse format right now, you could literally expect anything. You know, in Philly, I played 7 different decks in Swiss.
Right.
So you could potentially play against a deck you've never played against. And I think one example that I have is actually a long time ago, SS3 format, when I was playing Mono Blue SS3. I played against a Hirudegarn Veggie deck. It was the DBZ dudes were like really on that deck, and they took, when I won Portland, they took 2nd and 3rd with that Hirudegarn Veggie deck. And I had never played against it before, and I remember them saying that they thought it was a really favorable matchup against Mono Blue, and I got blown out game 1, like absolutely blown out. And I remember sideboarding, and I was like, how do I like beat this deck? Because I've never played it before.
Almost panicking, right? Because it's one of those like...
so I was just kind of like, I was thinking back on like what I was doing in that game. You know, I was like, maybe I attacked him too much. I gave him too many cards. So he just had too many resources. So games 2 and 3, I sided in some removal, and I literally just like did nothing. I just sat back, let him build his board, and then every time he built his board, I just like defended his attacks, cleared his board, saved my Sensu beams for when I was able to establish like a Vegito.
Right.
Because all those dudes are 20k, so Bean does nothing by itself unless I have 2 on my leader. And eventually was just able to like gas him out and drop like the 5-drop beers at the time, which was like a big game finisher for me. So it's just like stuff like that when you're going to formats where you could expect anything, even if you don't know the matchup. You know, obviously we're making videos and like podcasts or stuff like this to like help you in known matchups, but even in unknown matchups, like don't get discouraged if you're at a big event and you play against something you don't know. Just think back if you lose game one on like what you did and just any little thing you could do differently to just slightly disrupt your opponent, and you never know, because you might end up winning that match just by trying to adjust. But some players just get too down on themselves and like give up in matchups that they've never played before and they think is bad.
And if you think about it, even if there are, like you said, you played against 7 different decks in Philly. There's like still the possibility, or not a possibility either, rather it's going to be along the lines of, even with 7 different decks, those 7 different decks will still fall into specific categories and will still play along a certain spectrum. So you get in a position where you play against a deck you've never played against before. We'll try to simplify it a little bit. Look at it from an angle of, okay, what decks do I play against that are similar to this, and how do I approach those matchups? And that might be a way to improve an unknown matchup on the drop of a dime.
Exactly.
Yeah, like you're always gonna play against the random decks. Like they're always.
We lost you there for a second.
I was just saying you're always gonna play against a random deck at some point.
Right, and you know some of the times they're free wins, but some of the times, like Russell was saying,
my case in Ohio, they're absolutely horrible.
Right. You never know, but it what did you? It was the last round of Swiss, right, Shannon? You had to play against the red Clash Frieza.
Was literally my winning in, and it was red Clash Frieza, and I was like, "Well, this sucks."
Like just an unexpected matchup that nobody was playing that just happened to be really good.
Yep, and I should have lost, but he didn't negate my attack for whatever reason.
Jeez.
He had the after image in hand and did not play it.
It's just one of those things. Little mistakes like that are what separate the good players from the great players, right?
Danny literally went over and told you I was gonna lose my winning.
Yeah, and sometimes you do just get unlucky like that. Like my teammate on KTM, Anthony Mikulev, in what was it? In AC for the big ARG event. Shenron Gogeta like wasn't a big deck at the time, but there was 3 players that decided to play it at that event, and it ended up being a good meta call for that event because there was a lot of Kiku.
Right.
And my teammate was 5-0, and then played 3 Shenron Gogetas in a row.
Oh God.
And lost.
Poor guy.
All 3.
That's always the worst feeling.
Oh, I just remember after that tournament, he was like holding a Shenron in his hand, and he was just like, I want to rip this so bad.
That's kind of, but you can get it on the reverse end of the spectrum too. In Orlando, I played Blue Black Hirudegarn, and my best match was Janemba, and I played into Janemba 4 times. And so that can happen too sometimes, and that's sometimes how someone gets into a top placing finish with a less than ideal deck, or something with an odd strategy. Is just that it's got a niche matchup that's very good, and it happens to be one of the meta decks. And if you just play against that deck a lot, a meta call can get you there.
And Janemba was rampant at that tournament. It was everywhere.
It definitely was. I mean, it was 3 of the top 8 spots after Swiss minimum, I think.
I think I played against 3 in Swiss.
Yeah, I played against 4, and not one of them was hard, but none of them were, I wouldn't say easy either. Because Janemba does what it does.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I think Anthony was pretty free.
Well, I wouldn't say that, considering I didn't get the win. So,
I mean,
if he was free, I would have won, right? That's how that works.
Technically, okay, never mind. We won't get it.
But
I told him at that tournament, because he was like, I think I could beat you if we would have played and everything. And I told him, I was like, you're playing Janemba. I was like, you're not beating me.
As long as there's no time limit.
Right.
Yeah, to be fair, you're right. But, I mean, we've went over a lot of stuff here. I think a lot of this was really good information. Hopefully this has given a bit of expansive insight on Towa and just like competitive metagame decisions in general for anybody that's watching. Our guest was Russel Stelzer, and you're on which team again?
I'm on Kitchen Table Meta.
You're on Kitchen Table Meta, KTM. I know they have a YouTube channel, Twitch stream, all that jazz, Facebook pages. So, go follow them if you haven't already. You probably are, considering the name. But you can also find us on Twitch and on Facebook as Gamers and Geeks Elite on Facebook. We're most active there. But thank you to everybody watching, and have a nice day, and stay elite.